The evening was quiet, as most evenings are in our home. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen provided a soothing backdrop to the stillness, and the faint scent of lavender from the diffuser lingered in the air. I sat curled up on the couch, a book resting in my lap, the warmth of the evening lamp casting a golden glow over the room. It was a peaceful moment, one I had come to cherish in the chaos of daily life. And then he walked in. Brandon, my stepson. 18 years old, already towering over me at 6'2", with the kind of quiet confidence that made you forget he was still just a kid. But tonight that confidence was nowhere to be seen. He shuffled into the room, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. His dark, slightly messy hair fell into his eyes, and his gaze darted around the room before settling on the floor. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice barely above a murmur. I looked up from my book, setting it aside gently. "Hey Brandon, what's up?" He hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I'll need to talk to you about something." I patted the spot on the couch beside me, keeping my tone light. "Of course, come sit down." He hesitated for a moment before sinking into the armchair across from me. He ran a hand through his hair, still avoiding my gaze. I watched him carefully, my heart aching for him. Brandon wasn't usually one to shy away from conversation, but tonight he seemed different. Vulnerable. "What's on your mind?" I prompted gently. He took a deep breath, his eyes still fixed on the floor. "It's about my girlfriend. We've been talking about, doing it." I nodded slowly, my expression neutral but attentive. I had always been the one Brandon turned to for advice, even more so than his father. Our relationship was built on trust and mutual respect, and I had always made it clear that he could come to me with anything. "Okay," I said calmly, "what are you worried about?" Brandon finally looked up, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I don't know, I've never done it before. I just want to make sure I don't mess it up." I smiled softly, my heart swelling with affection for the young man I had come to think of as my own. "Brandon, it's completely normal to feel nervous about your first time, but the most important thing is to communicate with your partner, make sure you're both on the same page, and don't rush anything. It's not about getting it right, it's about being present and respectful." He nodded, his brow furrowed as he absorbed my words. "But what if she doesn't like it, or I do something wrong?" I leaned forward, my tone warm and reassuring. "It's natural to feel self-conscious, but remember, this is about both of you. Talk to her about what she's comfortable with, and don't be afraid to ask questions. And if something doesn't feel right, it's okay to stop. The most important thing is that you're both comfortable and enjoying yourselves." Brandon let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thanks, Sienna. I want it to be special for her, "I know," I said with a gentle smile, "and the fact that you care so much already shows you're on the right track. Just be yourself, Brandon. That's all anyone can ask for." He nodded again, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thanks, that helps a lot." "Anytime," I replied, my heart full, "and remember, you can always come to me if you have more questions. No judgment, okay?" Brandon chuckled softly, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. "Okay, I'll keep that in mind." As the conversation wound down, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotion. Pride for the thoughtful and considerate young man Brandon had become. Nostalgia for the boy he once was, now stepping into adulthood. And a quiet sense of gratitude for the bond we shared, a bond that had only grown stronger over the years. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the house was quiet. The stillness broken only by the soft sound of my breathing. My thoughts drifted back to Brandon, his nervousness, his vulnerability, the way he'd trusted me enough to share something so deeply personal. There was something undeniably stirring about the way he'd opened up to me, the way he sought my guidance. I rolled onto my side, the sheets cool against my skin, and let my mind wander. The memory of his flushed cheeks, the way he's fidgeted with his hands, the sound of his voice, it lingered in my thoughts. A quiet hum of something I couldn't quite name. My fingers brushed against my stomach, trailing slowly upward as I imagined him in the room with me. His tall frame hovering uncertainly, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. My breath hitched as my hand slid lower, the warmth of my own touch spreading through me. I closed my eyes, letting the fantasy take shape. His hands tentative but eager, reaching for me. His voice trembling as he whispered my name. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, my hips arching slightly as I pressed my fingers deeper, losing myself in the rhythm. It was wrong. I knew that. But in the darkness of the room, with nothing but my own thoughts to guide me, it felt inevitable. Brandon was no longer a boy. He was a man, strong and unsure and achingly vulnerable, and as I let the waves of pleasure wash over me, I couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to be the one to guide him, to show him what it meant to be desired. When the tension finally broke, I lay there trembling, my heart pounding in my chest, guilt and longing tangled together in my mind. But beneath it all was a strange sense of clarity. Brandon trusted me, he needed me, and I would be there for him no matter what. The next day I was in the kitchen slicing vegetables for dinner when I heard the front door open. I glanced up, expecting to see Brandon stride in with his usual carefree grin, maybe toss his backpack on the couch and start rambling about his day. But that's not what happened. Instead, he shuffled in, his shoulders hunched, his hoodie pulled up over his head like a shield. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word. He just walked straight past me, his eyes fixed on the floor, and disappeared down the hallway. A moment later, I heard the soft click of his bedroom door closing. I stood there, knife in hand, staring after him. My first instinct was to call out, to ask if he was okay. But something held me back. The way he'd looked, his face pale, his expression hollow, told me this wasn't the time to push. The next few days were the same. Brandon would leave for university in the morning, barely uttering a word, and return in the evening with the same heavy silence. He'd retreat to his room as soon as he stepped through the door, and I'd hear the muffled sound of music or the hum of his laptop. But he didn't come out, not for dinner, not for conversation, not for anything. At first I told myself it was just a phase. Teenagers were moody after all, and maybe he'd had a bad day. But as the days turned into a week, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Really wrong. I tried to talk to him a few times, knocking on his door and asking if he wanted to join me for a cup of tea or a walk around the neighborhood. But every time he'd give me the same response. A mumbled, "Not now, Sienna," or "I'm fine." His voice flat and distant. It wasn't just his silence that worried me. It was the way he carried himself. Brandon had always been so full of life, so confident in his own skin. But now he seemed smaller, like he was trying to fold himself into the shadows, to disappear. One evening, after yet another dinner where Brandon hadn't come out of his room, I decided enough was enough. I couldn't stand seeing him like this, so closed off, so lost. I needed to know what was going on, even if he didn't want to tell me. I made my way down the hallway to his room, my heart pounding in my chest. I paused outside his door, taking a deep breath before knocking softly. "Brandon," I called, my voice gentle but firm, "can I come in?" There was a long pause before I heard his muffled voice. "Yeah." I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn. Brandon was lying on his bed, staring up at the ceiling. He didn't look at me as I walked in, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Hey," I said softly, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "You've been quiet lately. I'm worried about you." He didn't respond at first, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. But then slowly he turned his head to look at me, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a kind of despair that made my heart ache. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice hoarse. I shook my head, reaching out to touch his arm. "No, you're not. I know you're not. Talk to me, Brandon, please." The room was heavy with silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on Brandon's nightstand. I sat there on the edge of his bed, my hand resting gently on his arm, waiting for him to speak. He was staring at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, his face pale and strained. Finally, he took a deep, shuddering breath and turned his head to look at me. His eyes were glassy, filled with a kind of pain that made my chest tighten. "It's stupid," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not stupid," I repeated firmly, squeezing his arm. "Whatever it is, it's clearly hurting you, and I want to help, Brandon, but I can't do that if you don't tell me what's wrong." He hesitated, his jaw clenching as if he were fighting back tears. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between wanting to keep it all inside and needing to let it out. Finally he spoke, his voice trembling. "It's about my girlfriend. We were going to do it." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral but encouraging. "Okay, tell me what happened." He swallowed hard, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "It started off fine, we were kissing and touching each other and everything felt good, but then—" He trailed off, his face reddening further, and I could see the shame in his eyes. "But then what?" I prompted gently. He took another deep breath, his voice cracking as he spoke. "When she saw me without my pants, she freaked out. She said, 'I won't do it,' and just stopped." I frowned, my heart aching for him. "Why? What happened?" He looked away, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. "She said it was too big, that she couldn't handle it." I felt a pang of sympathy for him, my chest tightening at the pain in his voice. "Oh, Brandon." He shook his head, his face flushed with humiliation. "She said she'd, give me a head instead, but after like 30 minutes she got tired and stopped, and it wasn't enough." I could hear the frustration in his voice, the raw ache of rejection, and it broke my heart. But then he continued, his voice shaking even more. "And now she's telling everyone at uni, all her friends, all my friends. They're all laughing at me, calling me broken, deformed, like there's something wrong with me." The words hung in the air heavy and cruel, and I felt a surge of anger on his behalf. How could anyone be so thoughtless, so heartless? "Brandon," I said firmly, turning his face to look at me, "there is nothing wrong with you, nothing at all." He looked at me, his eyes brimming with tears, and I could see the doubt in his expression. "Then why does it feel like there is? Why does everyone keep saying it?" I sighed, my mind racing as I tried to find the right words. "Listen to me, you're not broken, you're not deformed, you're unique, special, different maybe, but in the best way. And anyone who says otherwise is just ignorant." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. Instead, he sat up, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. I don't know what to do, I feel so lost." I reached out and pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly. "You're not alone, Brandon. I'm here and I'll help you figure this out, whatever it takes." He clung to me, his body trembling slightly, and I felt a surge of protective love for him. He was so young, so vulnerable, and I hated that he was going through this. But I was determined to be there for him, to help him through it no matter what. After a long moment he pulled away, his face calmer but the pain still lingering in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice still trembling. I smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair away from his face. "Always, Brandon, always." We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling between us. I could see the gears turning in his mind, the struggle to process everything that had happened. Finally, I broke the silence. "How about this?" I said gently. "Tomorrow evening we'll talk more, we'll figure this out together, okay?" He nodded, his expression a little lighter than it had been before. "Okay, thank you, Sienna." As I left his room that night, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Sadness for the pain he was in, anger at the cruelty of others, and a quiet determination to help him find his way back to himself. Brandon was stronger than he knew, and I would do everything in my power to remind him of that. The next evening, I decided to make things as comfortable as possible for Brandon. I prepared one of his favorite meals, spaghetti with garlic bread and a side salad, and set the table with care, lighting a few candles to create a warm, inviting atmosphere. When he walked into the kitchen, his expression softened slightly, and I could see the tension in his shoulders ease just a little. "Smells amazing," he said, his voice quiet but genuine. I smiled, handing him a plate. "I thought you could use a good meal. Sit down, let's eat." We sat at the table, and I made a conscious effort to keep the conversation light, peppering him with questions about his classes and friends, sharing a few silly anecdotes from my own day. Slowly, the mood lifted, and by the time we finished eating, Brandon was even laughing a little, his eyes brighter than they'd been in days. After dinner, we moved to the living room. The candles from the table cast a soft flickering glow, and the room felt cozy and intimate. I sat down on the sofa, patting the spot beside me, and Brandon hesitated for a moment before joining me. We talked for a while, the conversation flowing easily, but I could sense the underlying tension. Brandon was still carrying the weight of what had happened, and I knew it was time to address it directly. "Brandon," I said gently, turning to face him, "how are you feeling about last night's conversation?" He looked down at his hands, his cheeks flushing slightly. "I don't know, I believe you, but it's hard to shake what everyone else is saying." I nodded, my heart aching for him. "I understand, but sometimes, the only way to overcome these feelings is to face them head-on, to see things for what they really are." He glanced up at me, his expression uncertain. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "Brandon, I think it would help if you showed me. Not to make you uncomfortable, but so I can really reassure you that there's nothing wrong." His eyes widened and I could see the panic flicker across his face. "Sienna, I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to if you're not ready, but I want you to know that you're safe with me. No judgment, no pressure, just honesty." He hesitated for a long moment, his breathing shallow, before finally nodding. "Okay." He stood up, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the waistband of his sweatpants. I could see the fear in his eyes, the vulnerability, and it made my chest ache. Slowly he pulled them down, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. For a moment I was stunned. The size was more than I had expected, but that wasn't what struck me. It was the way he stood there, so unsure, so exposed, as if he expected rejection. "Brandon," I said softly, my voice filled with reassurance, "there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. In fact, you're blessed. You should be proud of who you are." He looked down, his hands fidgeting nervously. "But what if it's too much? What if no one can?" I cut him off gently, my tone firm but kind. "That's not true. It's just a matter of finding the right partner, someone who appreciates you for who you are. And until then, there's no shame in exploring things on your own." He glanced up at me, his expression uncertain. "But I tried that, it didn't work." I hesitated for a moment, weighing my words carefully. "Brandon, would it help if I showed you, if I helped you figure it out?" His eyes widened and I could see the conflict in his expression. I don't want to make you uncomfortable." I shook my head, my voice steady. "You're not. I'm here for you, Brandon, whatever you need." He nodded hesitantly, his face still flushed, and I gestured for him to sit back down beside me. As he did, I reached out, placing my hand gently on his thigh before moving closer. "Relax," I said softly, my tone soothing. "This is about you, about helping you feel comfortable in your own skin." I could feel the tension in his body as I began to guide him, my touch gentle but firm. His breathing quickened, and I could see the mixture of emotions on his face: uncertainty, relief, and a flicker of something deeper. As I continued, he slowly began to relax, his body responding naturally. It was an intimate moment, one filled with vulnerability and trust, and I was careful to keep the focus on his comfort and reassurance. He groaned softly, his head falling back against the sofa, and I could see the tension in his body begin to melt away. Eventually he reached his release, a low sigh escaping his lips as he leaned back, exhausted but visibly more at ease. I handed him a tissue, offering a soft smile as he cleaned himself up. "See," I said gently, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, "nothing to be ashamed of." He nodded, his face still flushed but his eyes clearer than they'd been in days. "Thank you, Sienna. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I replied, my voice warm. "Just know that you're not alone, okay? We'll get through this together." He smiled faintly, the weight on his shoulders seeming lighter. And we sat there for a while in comfortable silence. The room felt warmer, the air charged with a quiet sense of healing. And I knew we'd taken a step forward. When we finally parted ways for the night, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: pride for the courage he'd shown, relief that he seemed to be finding his way back to himself, and a quiet sense of gratitude for the bond we shared. Brandon was stronger than he knew, and I was determined to remind him of that no matter what it took. The morning light filtered gently through the kitchen windows, casting a soft golden glow over the room. The air was filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sizzle of scrambled eggs in the pan. I stood at the stove, flipping a slice of toast, my mind still lingering on the events of the previous night. It had been an intimate, vulnerable moment, but one that I hoped had brought Brandon some much-needed reassurance. Brandon shuffled into the kitchen a few minutes later, his hair still slightly messy from sleep, his hoodie hanging loosely off his tall frame. He looked hesitant, almost shy, as he pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. "Morning," I said, offering him a warm smile as I placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. "Morning," he mumbled, his eyes darting up to meet mine for a brief moment before dropping back to his plate. I sat down across from him, sipping my coffee and watching him carefully. The silence between us was thick, weighted with everything that had gone unspoken. Brandon picked at his food, his fork clinking softly against the plate, and I could feel the tension in the room. "Sleep okay?" I asked, breaking the silence with a gentle tone. He nodded, still not looking up. "Yeah, you?" "Fine," I replied, my voice steady. I hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Brandon, about last night." He froze, his fork hovering over his plate, and I could see the faint flush creeping up his neck. "Yeah. I just want to make sure you're okay," I said carefully, my tone soft but firm. "I know it was a lot, and I don't want you to feel like you have to talk about it if you're not ready. But I'm here if you need me." He set his fork down slowly, his hands clasping together on the table. He stared at them for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were trying to find the right words. I'm okay," he said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. "Actually, I'm more than okay. Last night, I really loved it." I felt a small smile tug at the corners of my lips, relief washing over me. "I'm glad, Brandon. I just want you to feel comfortable in your own skin." He nodded, his face still flushed, but there was a newfound confidence in his expression. He glanced up at me, his eyes holding mine for the first time that morning. "Do you think we could do it again tonight?" I paused, considering his request. It was a delicate situation, one that required careful navigation, but I could see how much it meant to him, how much it had helped him. "Okay," I said softly, nodding, "but let's make it more educational this time." He raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Education?" "Yes," I replied, my tone gentle but firm. "I think it would help if we watched an adult movie together, something that shows you that your size isn't unusual, that it can be a blessing." Brandon hesitated, his cheeks reddening further, but I could see the flicker of intrigue in his expression. "Okay, if you think it will help." "It will," I reassured him, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Trust me." Later that day, after Brandon had left for university, I found myself standing in front of my closet, trying to decide what to wear for the evening. I wanted the night to feel special, to create an atmosphere that was both comforting and seductive. After some deliberation, I settled on a sleek, form-fitting black dress that hugged my curves in all the right places. The material was soft and silky, and while it wasn't overtly revealing, it had an undeniable allure. Underneath, I chose a set of black lace lingerie, something subtle but spicy, just for me. I wanted to feel confident, to set the tone for the evening without making Brandon feel pressured. As I slipped into the dress, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror and smiled. It was a look that straddled the line between elegant and tempting, and I hoped it would help Brandon feel at ease. When Brandon came home that evening, he paused in the doorway when he saw me, his eyes widening slightly. I could see the faint blush creeping up his neck, and I offered him a warm smile in return. "Hey," I said softly, gesturing to the sofa, "come sit down." He hesitated for a moment before joining me, his hands fidgeting nervously. I turned on the movie, the screen flickering to life, and we watched together in comfortable silence. As it played, I pointed out the actors who were similar to Brandon in size, explaining that there was nothing unusual or wrong about him. "See," I said, gesturing to the screen, "there are plenty of men like you, and in the right context, it's something to be proud of." Brandon watched intently, his body language gradually relaxing as he absorbed what I was saying. The tension in his shoulders eased, and I could see the confidence slowly returning to his posture. As the movie progressed, I could sense a shift in him, a boldness that hadn't been there before. He turned to me, his eyes dark with a mix of curiosity and desire. "Sienna," he said, his voice low and hesitant, "do you think we could recreate that scene, the one on the screen?" I paused, surprised but not unprepared for the question. The request was bold, but I could see how important it was to him, how much it would mean to him to feel in control, to feel desired. "Okay," I said softly, nodding. But only if you're sure. He nodded eagerly, his eyes filled with a mixture of excitement and gratitude. I'm sure. The scene on the screen had shifted, a sensual dance, slow and deliberate, the woman on screen undressing with a grace that was both captivating and intimate. I glanced at Brandon out of the corner of my eye, noticing the way his breath had deepened, his eyes fixed on the television. There was a vulnerability in his expression, a mix of curiosity and nervousness that made my chest ache. I wanted this to be a moment of healing for him, of acceptance and connection. Without saying a word, I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate, mimicking the woman on the screen. Brandon's eye snapped to me, widening slightly as I began to sway to the rhythm of the music playing in the movie. The dress I wore was sleek and form-fitting, the fabric gliding against my skin as I moved. I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and intent, but I kept my eyes locked on the television, letting the moment build slowly. I reached behind me, unzipping the dress and letting it slide down my body, pulling at my feet. The black lace lingerie I wore underneath was revealed, its delicate details catching the light. I saw Brandon's breath hitch, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, but I could also see the flicker of desire in his eyes. I stepped closer to him, my movements fluid and unhurried, and brushed my hand against his arm. He shivered under my touch, his eyes darting up to meet mine. It's okay, I murmured, my voice soft but steady. This is about you, about helping you see how beautiful you are. He swallowed hard, his cheeks flushing a deep red, but he didn't pull away. I leaned in closer, my lips brushing against his in a gentle kiss, one that was meant to reassure rather than ignite. He responded tentatively, his hands hovering uncertainly before settling lightly on my waist. When I pulled back, I could see the mixture of emotions in his eyes, gratitude and desire, and a lingering uncertainty. I smiled softly, reaching for the waistband of his pants. Let me help you, I whispered, my tone warm and encouraging. He nodded, his breath quickening as I carefully slid his pants down, revealing the source of so much of his insecurity. For a moment, I paused, taking in the sight of him, and I could feel the weight of his anxiety in the room. Brandon, I said gently, my hand resting lightly on his thigh, there's nothing wrong with you, nothing at all. In fact, you're extraordinary. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine for reassurance, and I gave him a small, encouraging nod. Slowly, I began to guide him with my hand, my touch gentle but firm. His breath hitched, a soft groan escaping his lips as his body responded. I kept my movements slow and deliberate, watching his face carefully for any signs of discomfort. Instead, I saw only pleasure, the tension in his body melting away, replaced by a growing sense of release. It didn't take long. Brandon reached his climax sooner than either of us had expected, his body shuddering as he let out a low guttural moan. I could feel the intensity of the moment, the raw intimacy of it, and I stayed with him, my hand resting lightly on his thigh. As he caught his breath, for a long moment neither of us spoke. The room was filled with a quiet, charged energy, the air thick with emotion. Brandon's face was flushed, his expression a mix of surprise and relief, and I could see the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips, his eyes meeting mine with a warmth that made my chest ache. Thank you, Sienna, I don't know how to, I just... You don't have to say anything, I interrupted gently, my voice filled with affection. I'm here for you, Brandon, always. He smiled faintly, the tension in his body finally easing, and I knew that in this moment he felt seen, accepted. It was a small step, but a meaningful one, and I was determined to keep guiding him through it. We sat there together for a while, the sounds of the movie fading into the background, the room filled with a quiet sense of healing. It was an intimate, vulnerable moment, one that deepened our bond and helped Brandon reclaim a part of himself that he'd been ashamed of. The room was still and quiet, save for the soft hum of the television in the background. Brandon and I sat close on the sofa, the air between us charged with a raw intimacy that felt both comforting and electrifying. He was still catching his breath, his face flushed, and his expression a mix of surprise and mild embarrassment. I didn't expect that to happen so fast, he admitted, his voice low and a little sheepish. I chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. It's normal, Brandon, especially when it's something so new and intense. Don't worry about it. He nodded, but I could still see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. I knew this was a pivotal moment, a chance to help him feel more confident, more in control. Without saying a word, I leaned in closer to him, my body brushing gently against his. I could feel the warmth of his skin, the way he tensed slightly under my touch. "You know," I said softly, my voice laced with a playful tone, "sometimes it's not about how long it takes, it's about how much you enjoy it. And if you're up for it, we can always try for a second round." Brandon's eyes widened, his breath hitching as he looked at me. "Really?" I nodded, a small smile playing on my lips. "Really, but only if you want to." He hesitated for a moment, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap before nodding. "Okay, let's do it." I shifted closer to him, my fingers trailing lightly along his arm as I leaned in to press a soft kiss to his neck. He shivered under my touch, his breath quickening, and I could feel the tension in his body beginning to melt away. "Relax," I murmured, my voice warm and reassuring. "This is about you, about helping you feel good." I continued to tease him, my hands exploring his body with a gentle, deliberate touch. I brushed against him, my movements slow and unhurried, until I could feel him hardening again. He let out a low guttural groan, his head falling back against the sofa as his body responded. This time I took my time, drawing out the moment and letting the tension build. I kissed him deeply, my hands roaming over his chest and down his torso until he was trembling with need. "Sienna," he gasped, his voice rough with desire. Let's do this." I pulled back slightly, meeting his gaze. His eyes were dark, filled with a mixture of longing and vulnerability, and I knew this was a pivotal moment for both of us. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice gentle but firm. He nodded, his hands reaching out to grip my waist. "Yes, please." I smiled softly, my heart aching with affection for him. Slowly I guided him to lie back on the sofa. I could feel his hands trembling slightly as he held onto me, his breath quick and uneven. As I lowered myself, I could feel the intensity of the moment, the raw emotion, the deep connection that had grown between us. He groaned softly, his hands tightening on my hips, and I waited, letting him adjust to the sensation. The experience was unlike anything I'd expected. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, intimate, and deeply personal. I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the way he clung to me as if I were his anchor, and I knew that this moment was about more than just pleasure. It was about trust, acceptance, and a shared understanding of each other's desires and boundaries. We were together in a rhythm that felt natural and unforced, the room filled with the sounds of our breath. Brandon's body trembled, his hands gripping my hips as he tried to hold on. "Let go," I whispered, my voice soft and encouraging. He nodded, his eyes closing as he surrendered to the sensation. His finale was intense, his body arching off the sofa as he let out a low guttural moan. I stayed with him until he finally collapsed back onto the cushions, his chest heaving. We laid there together for a while, the room quiet save for the sound of our breathing. I could feel the weight of the moment settling between us, a quiet sense of healing, of connection, of something deeper than either of us had anticipated. Brandon turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and affection. "Thank you, Sienna. I don't know how to thank you enough." I smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair away from his forehead. "You don't have to thank me. I'm here for you, Brandon, always." He nodded, his expression calm but filled with emotion, and I knew that in this moment he felt seen, accepted. It was a small step, but a meaningful one, and I was determined to keep guiding him through it. When we finally parted ways for the night, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: pride for the courage he's shown, relief that he seemed to be finding his way back to himself, and a quiet sense of gratitude for the bond we shared. Brandon was stronger than he knew, and I was determined to remind him of that no matter what it took. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows, warm and golden, as Brandon and I sat at the table with steaming mugs of coffee. The air between us was calm but charged, the events of the night before still lingering in the space between us. Brandon stirred his coffee absently, his gaze fixed on the swirling liquid. He seemed calmer than I'd seen him in weeks, but there was a pensiveness in his expression that told me he was still processing everything that had happened. "How are you feeling this morning?" I asked, breaking the silence gently. He glanced up, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Better, a lot better actually. Last night it helped." I nodded, relief washing over me. I'm glad, really glad. He hesitated, his fingers tapping against his mug. Sienna, I need you to know how much I appreciate what you've done for me. It's everything, not just last night, but the way you've always been there for me. I don't think I could have gotten through this without you. His words hit me like a wave, and I felt a lump form in my throat. Brandon, you don't have to thank me. I care about you. I just want you to feel good about yourself. He nodded, his expression serious. I know, but what we've done, it's complicated. I mean, you've been my mentor, my friend, and now it's more than that, and I don't want to mess it up. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. Brandon, I think it's important for us to be honest about what this means. Last night was intense and emotional, and it definitely deepened our bond, but we need to figure out what comes next, what this means for us. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. I don't want to lose what we have. Whatever it is, friendship, mentorship, something more, I don't want to ruin it, but I also don't want to pretend like last night didn't happen, because it meant a lot to me. I nodded, my heart aching with a mix of emotions. I feel the same way. Last night was important for both of us, but we need to take things slow to figure this out together. He hesitated before speaking again. Do you think we can keep this, whatever it is, without it getting messy? I smiled faintly, reaching out to place a hand on his arm. I think we can, but it's going to take honesty and a lot of communication. We need to be open with each other about how we're feeling and what we want, and if things get too complicated, we need to be willing to take a step back. He nodded, his expression earnest. Okay, I can do that because you're important to me, Sienna, more than I think you realize. I blinked back the tears that pricked at my eyes. You're important to me too, Brandon, and I'm so proud of the progress you've made, but whatever we're building, it's not just about helping you anymore, it's about us, and that's something we need to figure out together. He smiled, his eyes filled with a quiet confidence. Okay, together. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling between us. The morning felt lighter, but also more charged. We'd crossed a threshold, and there was no going back, but I knew we'd face what came next together with honesty, with care, and with the bond we'd built. Eventually, Brandon stood up. I should probably get going, I've got a class. I nodded, standing as well. Of course, don't let me keep you. He hesitated, then stepped closer, pulling me into a hug. Thank you, Sienna, for everything. I hugged him back. Always, Brandon. When he pulled away, he gave me one last smile before heading out the door. I watched him go, the sunlight catching his silhouette as he stepped outside. Standing alone in the quiet kitchen, I reflected on the night before and the conversation we just had. This was more than a physical connection. It was a bond that had deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. It was complicated, full of questions and uncertainties, but also hope. The morning ended in quiet reflection, each of us carrying the weight of our connection and the promise of what it could become.